Welcome back. This is the fourth of a series of four podcasts that looks at Nazi family policy. The first two podcasts focused in on women in the Weimar Republic, and then the third podcast, which we just reviewed, focused in on education policy. What we're doing now is we're going to look at leisure policy. Okay, so we established in the previous podcast and in the revision session that Hitler, it was absolutely essential for Hitler for his long-term plans that he take control over young people's minds, because I use that sort of image of like a blank piece of paper ready to be written on. He could turn them into passionate Nazis, not just passive followers like the adult generation that Hitler had inherited. So Hitler's very much thinking about the future. Young children to be growing up to be sort of impassioned warriors. If you're a boy growing to be a man who will become a soldier for the Third Reich, or if you're a girl growing up to be a mother who will fight the battle for births, have as many racially pure children who in turn will grow up to become warriors that will make Germany strong. Okay, so Hitler very much sort of like viewed taking control of people's minds. There's two aspects to a child's day. There was the part of the day when they're in school, but that wasn't enough. And we looked at that in the previous podcast. Controlling education was one thing, but much of of children's lives were outside the control of schools. In other words, their leisure time, when they went home in the evenings and at weekends and in school holidays. As far as Hitler was concerned, they went back to the influence of their parents. And their parents may not be politically reliable because their parents had grown up before Hitler was leader of Germany. So how to deal with this? Well, basically, exactly the same principle. The Nazis needed to coordinate, bring under control, to Gleichschaltung, as they called it, leisure time. Now again, you may remember when we did about how he turned his chancellorship into a dictatorship, we did about coordination. Coordination means bringing all aspects of German life under Nazi control, and Hitler did it very, very quickly. In 1933, he became Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933, and by the summer of 1933, much of German life was brought under Nazi control, using the powers that he had given himself by the passage of the Reichstag Fire Decree and the Enabling Act. Okay, so the person who was put in charge of controlling leisure time was Baldur von Schirach, and again there's a picture of him to the right. He was in charge of the Hitler Youth. During World War II, the leadership changed. It was a man called Arthur Axmann, and we'll do more about him when we do the Nazi Germany at war in the final revision session. Okay, so basically the Nazis created lots of different youth organisations under an umbrella heading called the Hitler Youth. Now the Hitler Youth actually consisted of four sub-youth groups, okay, four youth groups that sat underneath the main organisation. And you really do need to learn the names of those four youth groups. So, put them on flashcards, stick them on your wall, learn them by heart, okay? So if you were a boy, okay, so focusing on the boys first, teenage boys, the youth group was called the Deutsche Jungfolk, or the Young German Folk. If you can learn the German, that's great, otherwise you learn the English. They were for 10 to 14-year-olds. And so they were the younger boys, not the teenagers, they were the younger boys. The teenagers, the organisation was actually called the Hitler Youth. Okay, so the term Hitler Youth actually had two meanings. It meant the organisation for 14 to 18-year-old boys, but it also meant the overarching all four organisations for boys and girls. If you were a girl, young girls, the organisation was called the Young Mädel. That was for 10 to 14-year-old girls. And for teenage girls, it was called the BDM, or the Bund Deutscher Mädel. the League of German Maidens, which was for 14 to 18-year-old girls. Strong emphasis in all Hitler Youth groups on fitness and exercise. Now, of course, the type of exercise you did was very much based on your gender. Boys was very much about team games and sporting activities. Women, so the girls, was very much on domestic type activities. A lot of doing hula hoops, that sort of thing, types of exercise that would strengthen your hips. As you can see in the picture, there's a picture to the right there. The Hitler Youth typically would go to the countryside. That was really good fun for German children. It's important to remember that when Hitler came to power in 1933, it was on the back of the 4 years of the Great Depression, in which unemployment was rife. Most German children didn't have opportunities, for example, to go to the countryside. Their lives were very desperately poor, sitting on the street corners in the cities and the towns. And so when Hitler came to power and offered these free clubs with exciting activities, going camping at weekends and in the evenings into the countryside, which is where they were based, it was very, very attractive and very, very appealing. So strong emphasis on going into nature. And remember, that very much tied in with Nazi ideas. Keep using this phrase, blood and soil, where Hitler believed the best values, the best blood, the best racial values came from the countryside. Breathing in the fresh country air was sort of seen to be purifying your body, etc. Okay, so again, just make sure you fill your answers with precise information when you talk about leisure activities. We've already talked about the exact names of the 4 youth groups. Too many students would just simply say Hitler Youth, and they won't actually go into those sorts of details. Likewise, be very precise on this topic. It was not actually compulsory to join the Hitler Youth until 1939. That's important that you emphasise that. It was called the Hitler Youth Law of 1939. It was compulsory. There was a Hitler Youth Law of 1936 which strongly encouraged all children to join the Hitler Youth groups, but it wasn't a requirement until 1936. Although, and it's not actually mentioned on this slide, but it's worth you making a note that before 1936, very early, very quickly, Hitler outlawed all other youth groups. There were lots of youth groups in Germany in 1933, many of them run by the churches, by the Catholic Church and by the Protestant churches. Hitler, and we mentioned about the Concordat with the Catholic Church, Hitler's deal with the Catholic Church, he promised to leave alone and not touch anything to do with the Catholic Church as long as the Catholic priest didn't speak against the Nazis. Well, Hitler broke that very, very quickly, and Catholic youth groups were outlawed. So children really, if they wanted to continue going to youth groups, they had little choice other than to join the Hitler Youth. So there was lots of voluntary joining of the Hitler Youth, and to be honest, the Hitler Youth was very attractive in the early years. It was fun, it was different, children really, really liked it. So membership did grow, membership rose and learned those figures from 5.4 million in 1936 to 8 million by 1939. And it continued to be really important during the war. During the war, the Hitler Youth did a lot of work in Germany, raising money and for charities. We mentioned the Winter Relief Fund. That was largely done by the SA, collecting money for winter relief, but during the war, many men had been sent off to fight, so children filled that gap, and also helping in the emergency services. So we'll do more about that when we do Nazi Germany at War in the final revision session. So an assessment, did it work? Okay. Key thing, very much like I said with women's policy, try to sort of view it as 2 time periods. You've got 1933 to 36, the early years. Now in those early years, 1933 to 36, youth policies were very appealing. As I said, they were different in contrast to the Great Depression, the difficult years of unemployment. the Hitler Youth activities, the groups, etc., were very appealing. It was seen to be an escape from the cities, an opportunity to go to the countryside at the weekend. That was very, very appealing. But then you've got the period 1936 onwards, okay, up to 1939 when war broke out, and then obviously you've got 1939 to 45 when Germany was at war. And during this whole period, 36 to 39, 39 to 45, inevitably Hitler Youth became much more of a kind of like a boot camp, a place for training children to become future soldiers. So the youth camps became less fun. They became more about drilling for war. Okay, so preparing them for war, and as a result, by 1939, many children had turned off the Hitler Youth. They didn't like the Nazis were trying to control them and trying to turn them into soldiers. Not everybody. Particularly the younger children had been very much brainwashed into these ideals, but certainly the teenagers, by the time you get to the war, many children were beginning to rebel. And we have mentioned in a previous revision session the so-called swing kids and the Edelweiss pirates, children who literally, deliberately wrote graffiti, went out in the evenings, wrote graffiti on walls, listened to American jazz music, which the Nazis saw as black music, racially impure music, but they deliberately rebelled, as teenagers will often do. But of course this was very dangerous to do in Nazi Germany, because if you were picked up, and it did happen, you were arrested, and there were public executions of children in Nazi Germany. Okay, so there's the usual factual test. Print that off, it's in the folder in Frog, fold it over, practice it until you absolutely know all those answers off by heart. Put them on flashcards, stick them on your wall, look at them every day, as you will do with all the factual tests from all of these revision sessions. That is so crucial that you do that. So many marks are lost in the exam because the answers are written in very general terms. Your understanding is fine, but you've got to back everything up with a precise knowledge, and that's the purpose of these factual tests. Pause the podcast at this moment and then press play again, because on the next page you will see the answers to the questions. But if you go to the Frog folder and download the factual tests, as you should be doing with all of these, the factual tests have actually got the answers written on them. There are the answers to those questions. Hopefully that was a useful podcast for you. And the next revision session will be on Nazi racial policy, with further podcasts to follow. Remember also, when you go to the web page for this Nazi family policy, it is absolutely crucial you play the separate podcasts that walk and talk you through model answers to past questions on policies towards women and youth. Thank you.